Okay, great. So, again, my name is Matt Dooley, and I want to talk with you all today and share some of the thoughts that I had as I thought about Hamlet. And I think you'll find that there's some actually kind of uncanny connections to what our society is going through right now in terms of some of the thoughts and questions raised by the scene that I'm going to look at in Hamlet. So this paper is called "To What Base Uses We May Return: The Affective Function of the Graveyard Scene in Hamlet." So if we think about Hamlet, most of us will think about this moment with the skull of Yorick, which he was the jester who was long dead by the time the play actually starts. And at this pivotal moment in the play, Hamlet encounters the skull of Yorick. And most scholars would say that this is one of the most important moments in the play, and some would even argue it's maybe one of the most important moments in Western theater generally. And many scholars have examined what this moment means, and I thought, in hopes of saying something at least slightly original about this moment, that I would look at not what does this moment mean, but what did this moment do for the people who saw it when it was first staged. We believe it was first staged around 1602, right near the end of the reign of Queen Elizabeth. And so that's what this paper is about, is what did this moment do? How did it function for the society in which it was first staged? And what I would like to suggest today is that it functioned as a thought experiment, as an embodied form of social thought that was a response to some of the trauma and some of the questioning that was brought about by the Reformation. And it was really meeting an emotional need, an affective need for the world in which it was staged. And to do this work, I looked to the framework of cognitive ecology. The scholars John Sutton and Evelyn Tribble have written that mental activities include parts of the social and material world. And so the idea with cognitive ecology is that we need to consider thought as something that incorporates the world beyond our skulls. So for today, I want to use this framework to look at how the cultural context, the script of Hamlet, the actors, and the skull of Yorick all worked together on stage to produce this embodied form of social thought. So this is a painting of an Elizabethan audience watching a Shakespearean play. And I want to suggest that the audiences of Shakespeare's day, they didn't just observe the graveyard scene, but they participated in it vicariously by observing it. And I'm going to get a little more into how that actually worked. But to understand how this process works, we first need to look at the cultural context. So Kristen Poole, who's at the University of Delaware, has written, "Transformations in religious belief were brought about by the Protestant Reformation. The confluence of multiple, often contradictory spatial and theological epistemologies resulted in unsteady beliefs about the universe." And to get a little more closer to England itself, Stephen Mullaney has written that in the space of a single generation, from 1530 to 1560, England officially adopted and officially abandoned no fewer than 5 state religions. Shakespeare's generation inherited a deep and daily ambivalence at the affective core of the self. Oh, let's see. Okay. To get a look at what that seemed like to the person on the street, this is a great quote that I found from a tailor in 1577. He said, "What manner of religion we have here in England I know not, for the preachers now do preach their own inventions and fantasies, and therefore I will not believe any of them." In other words, this cultural context produced a lot of affective doubt. Stephen Mullaney, again, he writes that Elizabethans did not only not know what to believe, but they also didn't know what to feel. So they were suffering from both intellectual and affective doubt. They weren't sure about what to think about God, because they'd gone back and forth from one belief system to another so frequently. And that meant that they also didn't know how to feel about themselves and how to feel about these big questions, especially the question of burial rites. So this is one very specific example of a traumatic event that I think really shook the core of Elizabethan society. This was in 1549, so before the reign of Queen Elizabeth. The Lord Protector of England, a fervent Protestant, ordered that the bones in the charnel house of St. Paul's Cathedral be purged of its tens of thousands of human remains. It took 1,000 cartloads to accomplish the task. Thousands of bones were dumped into a marsh outside London without any ceremony. For Londoners, the charnel house was a destination and an origin, a future and a past, a place to which they themselves were bound, as well as a place where their ancestors could be located, housed, and cared for. So I want us to imagine for a moment the sense of dislocation and alienation from the past that such an act would have engendered among the populace. Shakespeare, born only 15 years after this event, undoubtedly knew of it. And so my suggestion here is that Hamlet, as a work of embodied social thought, and especially this scene that we're going to analyze, served as a response, consciously or not, to the uncertainty of Elizabethans who were haunted by their world's abrupt rupture with centuries-old traditions. And the truth is, we don't really even have to imagine what this might have felt like, because unfortunately, I think we're getting a sense of what that feels like today. This is a headline from the New York Times on April 9th. I'm sure you've seen headlines like this and others where people are being buried without really as much ceremony as what was happening before the virus. Even funerals that are taking place, there's this social distancing that's occurring, so people aren't able to embrace each other. Kind of a lot of the physical interactions that characterize mourning has kind of been taken away from us. And so I think there's some uncanny parallels between that sense of dislocation that Elizabethans felt and, unfortunately, some of the dislocation that our culture is going through right now, as our sense of how to bury people is changing. I also want to introduce this idea of the stage as a laboratory. So if you observe a thought experiment, you actually participate in it. And there were real dangers, right, in deviating from the state religion, from the Church of England. 63 people were executed under Elizabeth. And so there was really only one place where the public could think through these theological questions, these hard theological questions, without fear of repercussions. And that was vicariously at the theater. By virtue of being a fictional character, Hamlet is able to publicly think through these questions. And so by observing Hamlet's questions, the audience is able to participate in his questioning as well. So let's get into the actual scene. This is from 1969. It's got Ian Richardson as Hamlet and a very young Patrick Stewart playing Horatio. And I'm going to try and skip us forward a bit to where the relevant moment starts. So Hamlet, of course, is in the graveyard, and a gravedigger is handing him a skull.
Yorick skull. The king's jester.
This?
Mean that.
Let me see. Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio. A fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times. And now, how abhorred in my imagination it is. My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed, I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now? Your gambols? Your songs? Your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning. Quite champ fallen. Now, get thee to my lady's chamber, and tell her, let her paint an inch thick. To this favor she must come. Make her laugh at that. I prithee, Horatio, tell me one thing.
What's that, my lord?
Dost thou think Alexander looked o' this fashion i' the earth?
E'en so.
And smelt so. Ha!
E'en so, my lord.
To what base uses we may return, Horatio? Why may not imagination trace the noble dust of Alexander till he find it stopping a bunghole?
But to consider too curiously, to consider so.
Oh, faith, not a jot. but to follow him thither with modesty enough and likelihood to lead it, as thus. Alexander died, Alexander was buried. Alexander returneth to dust. The dust is earth. Of earth we make loam. And why of that loam, whereto he was converted, might they not stop a beer barrel? Imperious Caesar.
So the bit about the get thee to my lady's chamber, that's a little digression I don't want to get into. I really want to focus first on what skulls represented at the time so that we can understand this pose that Hamlet has with the skull. So what did skulls represent at the time this was staged? Well, skulls were a common motif throughout Renaissance art, and they often served a religious purpose. Often a saint is depicted with a skull, suggesting his awareness of the vanity of the human endeavor. You see here, this is a painting by Caravaggio, painted in 1606, so only a few years after Hamlet was staged. And it's a painting of St. Francis, and he's holding a skull in his hands. But in this case, as was often the case, at the time period, skulls were understood to be used as a devotional object. So in this case, the skull is kind of inspiring St. Francis to pray more fervently, to be more spiritual, so on and so forth. But if we look at how it functioned in Hamlet, it was the skull changes drastically in terms of how it's used. Because Hamlet here, and this is actually an image of Sarah Bernhardt, the first female actress to play Hamlet, but in the text you can see, as well as in this image here, that the skull is being used not to spur Hamlet towards thinking about how to be a better person necessarily, or how to get into heaven. Rather, he's using it to kind of question fundamental assumptions about what it means to be a person. So if we look at the text exactly, Hamlet says, "To what base uses we may return, Horatio, why may not imagination trace the noble dust of Alexander, till he find it stopping a bunghole?" So here Hamlet sets to work devising a new hypothesis about what happens to us after we die. Alexander, and this is Alexander the Great he's referencing, Alexander, and by extension all of humanity, is confined to the material realm. There's no escape. And despite Horatio's caution that it was too curiously to consider it so, Hamlet presses on. He kind of elaborates this initial hypothesis. Well, maybe Alexander died, he's buried, he returns to dust. Why not we might say that he just ends up being a plug for a beer barrel, which is both ironic and tragic and also pretty disturbing, especially if you think about the context of the time, where such bold kind of entertainments of thought weren't really allowed in a public way, unless it was a fictional character who was doing it. So I want you to imagine the audience observing Hamlet as he speaks aloud these lines. Perhaps some are fascinated, others repulsed, others bored or disinterested. But regardless of the specific cognition occurring with the individual minds of the audience members, we can see this moment with Yorick's skull, where he's questioning the skull, and then he's kind of using it as a catalyst again to engage in this thought experiment as a response to the doubt that had been sowed by the ceaseless conflict between competing theological claims, and a need for Elizabethan society to start questioning those age-old assumptions and to start looking for new answers. Now, I don't want to suggest that Hamlet is advocating like one specific viewpoint. As you look at the entire play, you see that it's very hard to nail him down to one specific theological stance. I do just hope that I've shown how Hamlet's moment with Yorick functioned as a way to question the era's traditional theologies and to facilitate a public collective consideration of new and alternative hypotheses about human nature. So as I start to wrap up here, I just want to suggest that we can best understand past societies not by the beliefs that they held, but also by the questions that their artists asked. Prompted by Yorick's skull, Hamlet's radical thought experiment was certainly a work of genius by Shakespeare, but it was also a necessary form of embodied social thought. It was a response to the affective doubt caused by the Reformation. And as this image shows at the very end, I think Shakespeare will remain as relevant as ever, no matter where our species ends up. So thank you for listening and for thinking. I guess I'll be able to answer any questions that folks might have once we're done with all the presentations. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. That was really wonderful. And we will indeed go right next to, yes, feel free to use the reaction buttons down there to show your approval. All right, so we will move next to Micah. Micah Winters is a first-year graduate student pursuing an MA in literature at the University of St. Thomas. Micah received a bachelor's in literature from Taylor University